Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm joined by Josh Pelland to deep dive into the fascinating concept of muscle resensitization. Josh has been exploring how muscles adapt to training stimuli over time and why they might stop growing efficiently, a phenomenon often referred to as adaptive resistance. We start by unpacking what resensitization is and what initially led Josh to explore this concept. We dig into the research and studies, including key findings from Ogasawara and Carvalho, and how they support or challenge the idea of resensitization. Josh sheds light on the current understanding of periodization for hypertrophy, and we tackle whether the common strategies we use to vary training like exercise selection, rep ranges, and deloads actually contribute to resensitizing our muscles. Josh also addresses the anecdotal evidence many athletes report, like improved pumps and muscle disruption after changes in their routines, and how these experiences align with the scientific findings. We discuss the importance of novelty in training, especially for more advanced athletes, and how to incorporate variation to help prevent staleness and keep our muscles growing. Finally, Josh provides practical advice for coaches on how to effectively implement resensitization strategies into their training programs, ensuring clients continue to see the progress and don't plateau. Guys, a really interesting chat here. Hopefully you guys take a lot on board. As a reminder, if you do enjoy this, make sure to share it across social media. Josh would appreciate a tag. I'd appreciate a tag. Let us know if you enjoyed it. Give us a review, share it, and it helps the podcast grow. Give us a like if you're over on Instagram. Make sure to subscribe. I appreciate you. But without further ado, let's get into the show. Josh, I know you've been working really hard as ever, and I know you're working particularly on the concept of, or doing work surrounding the concept of resensitization. I think many of the listeners will be aware of the term kind of resensitization because I think Mike Israetel really popularized that quite a lot. We actually did work on like a primer phase and did an ebook surrounding that when we were quite convinced about its utility for various reasons outside of just muscle resensitization. But for the listeners, could you briefly explain kind of what you see as resensitization and what led to you wanting kind of to look into it deeper?
Yeah, I love that lead in because the examples you mentioned were essential to my interest in this topic in general. You mentioned primer phases, which maybe we'll get into whether or not you guys use those anymore, or your experience with that. You also mentioned Mike Israetel popularizing the concept, and that's where I was, I don't know if introduced to the concept, but at least started thinking about the concept more and more, and I find it very intriguing. So you asked like why resensitization? Why am I interested in this? I think it's practical, potential practical applications like that. But honestly, from a PhD dissertation perspective, which that's, kind of the nuts and bolts of what I'm working on right now, it kind of works out well to just be a really nice overarching topic to understand how muscle grows, why it grows, and have a really fruitful intellectual experience, to be honest, which I really value during, hopefully the final year or two of my my many years in undergrad or graduate school. So that's kind of where I come from. It is, I think it's an interesting intellectual avenue, and then kind of pair that with some anecdotes I've seen both in my coaching practice and also reports from other folks' coaching practices or other individuals' experiences. So about 75% of our audience, and subsequently about 75% of our coaching clients, whether it's myself or one of our other coaches at Data Driven Strength, have some sort of strength goal. So most of the anecdotes that I'm aware of are in that realm, and we've just seen it enough times to take it seriously is kind of the way that I would phrase it. So a relatively common one, and I think if there's any powerlifting coaches listening to this, they would probably nod their head at this, is that sometimes when someone has kind of an relatively extended break from quote unquote normal training, whether that's due to an injury or just an ache or a pain or some sort of life event that just causes them to not train as normal, sometimes that come up is really interesting, right? And sometimes they get back to where they were extraordinarily fast, and sometimes even beyond that, with easier training or perhaps the same training they were doing before, and that kind of propels them beyond where they were before. Now that's strength. Luckily for strength, it's a little bit more quantifiable. You can be a little bit more objective about it, especially on shorter timescales. Whereas, if someone's goal is just hypertrophy or just physique, it's a little bit trickier. And maybe you have to wait a little bit longer to truly know what's going on under the hood. But that's a long way of saying that this whole concept of resensitization, there's a lot of anecdotes, but there's not a ton of research. So maybe we could dive into what we have to go off of and what we don't have to go off of. But I don't know if there's any thread you want to pull in there.
Yeah, it's you actually mentioned, do we use it anymore? I can't speak for the other coaches, but we certainly don't particularly advertise that ebook strongly. Not that I don't think it's a well-written ebook. I think that the information in there still holds. It's just my personal experience and the utility of that phase is less and less. I'm less maybe convinced by resensitization, but that might also be becoming from a bias, because it's very hard to sell yourself on something that is taking time away from what typically grows muscle, and to hopefully grow more afterwards when you're like, hey, I just want to keep on going. It's easier to convince yourself a deload. Yeah, I mean, I'm beat up and like I'm tired. I got to deload or my body's going to do it for me. But a whole, like, I don't know, 4 weeks, say, of kind of easier or different training to typical hypertrophy training for an out and out bodybuilder becomes a hard sell to. And that's kind of where we went with the primer phase, because it's meant to like set you up and prime you for more muscle growth and potentiate muscle growth, in fact. And yeah, so I'm glad you're looking into it. And as I've heard you talking about it, there's many avenues you can also take this concept in terms of, like you've talked about specialization phases and different things like that. So yeah, I don't know if there's any particular area that or you could talk to some of the research, I guess, would be interesting for people. So like why, in your kind of eyes, or I guess mechanistically, over time might muscles not grow as efficiently? Do we have any insights into that?
Yeah. I'll add in like an additional reason to my last answer as to why I'm interested in it. And that is that I actually think the programming implications of it are very broad. Like they almost apply to everything when we really, nail down exactly what we mean by resensitization. So it's probably going to be helpful for the listener to understand exactly what we're talking about when we say resensitization. And when I talk about this concept, I actually like to start with desensitization. So before I even get to desensitization, let's just talk about sensitivity in general. So we'll kind of zoom in on muscle growth. And when I say sensitivity, what I mean is, what sort of hypertrophic response, what sort of muscle growth response do we get from a given stimulus? The easiest way to think about this is if you take someone that's never trained before, their muscles are very sensitive to training. Whereas Steve, unfortunately, your muscles aren't quite as sensitive to training as they were, your first year of training. So from a very high level, from untrained to, 20-year seasoned lifter, we're definitely going to see desensitization. I think that's not only apparent when you think about it that way, but it's also well documented. We see in studies that have extended training protocols and have multiple measures of muscle hypertrophy throughout that study, that the rate of hypertrophy decreases over time. So you get diminishing returns from a given stimulus. A study that I like to reference here, because in a lot of ways, the study we're currently conducting on this concept is not necessarily a replication of this study, but instead a different approach to this sort of design. So there was a study from Ogasawara in 2013, and it's pretty well discussed, pretty well cited, but it's a really well done study. If I recall correctly, they used MRI for muscle size measurements, which is the gold standard. They had a pretty solid sample size, again, if I'm recalling correctly here. And it was also a 6-month study. And they had one group that trained continuously. So I think it was 9 sets per week of bench press. And I think they looked at pec hypertrophy and also tricep hypertrophy. we don't have to get into the nitty gritty of the design, but basically the researchers took hypertrophy measurements every 3 to 6 weeks throughout that 6-week period for that continuous group. And they actually have a really nice plot in that study where they have the rate of hypertrophy per week over the 24 weeks. And basically you see this decline in the rate of hypertrophy, right? You see the strongest response right away. You see less of a response and a gradually less and less of a response, right? It's kind of this logarithmic decrease in the rate of hypertrophy, if you will. And starting around week 10, you kind of had half of the rate of progress as you did at the start. These were previously untrained people, but I do think untrained people are probably helpful here to see this concept in general. But again, we see this very well documented that desensitization to a given stimulus absolutely occurs, and I think that's pretty apparent. Now, the question becomes, can we counteract that at all? And that brings us to resensitization, which is basically, is there a way that we can move the chess pieces around the chessboard in terms of program design in order to attenuate that desensitization? And luckily, in this Ogasawara study from 2013, they also had a group that, trained for 24 weeks, but they didn't train for the entire 24 weeks. They went 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on. And what you saw, if you just look at the pre-testing measures to the post-testing measures, there wasn't a meaningful difference in muscle growth between that continuous group or that periodic group. And if you look at the slopes of the progress once they, go back to training after their time off, you see a faster rate of progress. So in a lot of ways, this is evidence for resensitization. They adjusted their training. In this case, they took time off and they saw a faster rate of progress. So in my view, resensitization does exist when you think about it as just how sensitive is your muscle to a stimulus in terms of muscle growth. But I think the question we actually care about is, can we ever move the chess pieces around the chessboard so that the periodic group or some other periodization approach actually ends up at a higher point? So that leads me to kind of the fundamental question that I think we don't know from the research. And you have to understand that periodic group, so the group that took 3 weeks off a couple times throughout the study, they lost muscle during that time period. So in other words, the reason they resensitized might have just been because they lost muscle and they were regaining what they had lost, because it's also pretty well documented that muscle regain is faster than initial gain. So I think this is a proof of concept that time off from training or time of reduced workload training isn't the end of the world, because you're probably going to be resensitized to some degree, and you'll probably catch up so long as your time off was reasonable. But what it doesn't tell us, and unfortunately there isn't a ton of other research to go off of, is whether other sorts of programming approaches could again lead that periodized sort of approach to a higher endpoint at the end of the day.
Really nicely explained. And yeah, it is that question of, rather than having lost muscle and then regained it more quickly and ending up at the same place by doing less, can you have maintained that through some, primer phase or something like this, to then still see that potentiation effect? Or is it a necessity to have lost something to get the faster gains? And if you just maintain it, you're just back where you were before, or gaining similar to the other group. So I guess actually, interestingly enough, the group that trained continuously, they must have trained, did they do more total volume over that period of time? Because they never had those periods of time off. So almost puts into question a little bit, our understanding of volume, and more, it tends to lead to more growth. And they didn't see that. It's an interesting maze of things to be thinking about.
Yeah, you're spot on, man. And these are the questions I've wrestled with since I kind of decided this would be my main area of focus for a bit. Most volume studies just say, hey, we're going to have a group trained with X sets and another group trained with Y sets and see what happens, right? See how it shakes out. It's often the previous training volumes often are not controlled for. I actually think the Ennis study does a really fantastic job of that. They basically standardized that pre-training period. That costs additional resources in terms of time and whatnot, and the pros and cons of that have definitely been debated. There's a really nice narrative review paper from Hammert and colleagues in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, which basically discusses whether pre-training volumes matter. We actually intended to meta-analyze whether pre-training volumes matter. When we did a sweep and an extraction of all of the volume research, we realized there wasn't nearly enough data to meta-analyze it, and the reporting wasn't nearly precise enough. So we just don't know there. But yeah, I think what you were saying regarding, can resensitization occur after maintenance is really interesting, right? Because that's probably what you would expect from a primer phase, is you don't lose muscle like they did in this Ogasawara study, but you maintain where you're at and you prime what's about to come. I'd say the closest study we have on that is a study from Carvalho and colleagues. Basically, what they did is they had both groups train with 8 to 12 rep max weights for 3 weeks. And then one group trained with 1 to 3 rep max weights for 3 weeks, while the other group stayed at 8 to 12 RM. And then the final 5 weeks, both groups were back to 8 to 12 RM. So put simply, one group took a little strength phase for 3 weeks in the middle of the program, and they did see worse hypertrophy during that time period. But then the hypertrophy did kind of accelerate after the fact. Now, it's one study. I don't have a ton of confidence in using this study for a few reasons, in terms of saying, hey, we definitely resensitize after these maintenance volume periods with more strength type training. I think we would need a lot more evidence to make that claim. But that's ultimately what our lab is looking to add some insight to. So what we're doing right now is it's a within subjects design, and one calf of each individual is going to stay at a constant volume, just like that Ogasawara continuous group. The other calf is going to be at the same volume for 3 of the 5 training blocks, but during 2 of the 5 training blocks, they're going to do what we estimate will maintain their muscle mass. So it's a replication in a way of the Ogasawara study, but instead of detraining and loss of muscle mass, our hope is that they will maintain muscle size, or if they still grow during those periods, it's at least attenuated so that we can see what that rate of progress is after the fact. And to me, that is the fundamental question that we don't have clarity on, is, again, is resensitization, when it occurs in the research, just the result of regaining lost ground? So, a result of recent atrophy. And once we have some more insight into that exact question, that's going to open up a lot of further research questions. But this is the fundamental thing that I think we need to double click on in terms of a scientific community, see how that shakes out, and then go from there.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And by the way, your point of, it's actually really interesting to think resensitization definitely does occur, because you think about when you think about desensitization, we all know as you become more advanced, muscle gain becomes slower. Adaptive resistance, I guess, is a term that could kind of be built in there, or just adaptation in general, and you have to do more to get less in the end as you become more and more advanced. And so it is that question of, like you said, there's the broader macro cycle kind of concept of taking like a strength phase or a lower volume period, or even like an active recovery of 2 weeks, say, away from the gym or very low volumes, or some of those shorter meso to meso kind of programming elements where you just, I don't know, exercise selection, rep range, those sort of variables, or like slight volume manipulations there even, to kind of get that end result. Which leads me to a question, because you did a great job of talking through I can't even say his name. The 2 studies, Ogasawara and the Carvalho, where they kind of show some support for this idea. But we also have the research on periodization for hypertrophy. What does that tend to show?
Yeah, man. The periodization research for hypertrophy is a tough one, because a lot of the studies are not necessarily designed to maximize hypertrophy. So in other words, they're often studies that are probably better characterized as strength periodization studies. And then they also happen to measure muscle size. Now, that's not totally true. Like there are definitely some exceptions. And that's also not a reason to say, oh, we're going to completely ignore it. I just don't think that, the average listener of this podcast that's interested in maximizing hypertrophy is going to look at many of the periodization studies we have for hypertrophy and say, oh yeah, that gives me insight into, a periodization approach that I might consider employing. But nonetheless, from a broad strokes perspective, we don't see a clear advantage or disadvantage to periodization in general. And that would be including things like block periodization, daily undulating periodization, linear periodization, reverse linear periodization. Again, it seems to kind of be a negligible effect so long as total volume or average volume over the entire study is equated. And I'm also really interested in periodization. And I actually think maybe I'm giving this concept of resensitization more credit than what it deserves. But I think this is the cornerstone concept that would underlie potential periodization models for hypertrophy. So I view the Ogasawara study, the Carvalho study. There's a couple other ones actually in the realm of more so muscle memory, and like how muscle kind of recalls how to grow, whether that's from like an epigenetic standpoint even. I view that as more interesting in terms of periodization research because, again, that would underlie other periodization models. And before we have an answer to that question, I think we're kind of taking shots in the dark sometimes with other periodization sort of approaches.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And it's good also to hear because I think that is a soundbite you hear maybe in the evidence-based online social media space that periodization doesn't matter for hypertrophy, like it as long as volume's matched. And I think there's many things that are true like that, but when you delve into it a little bit more, it's like, but we just don't have a huge amount of data that's super specific to kind of the goal of maximizing hypertrophy. And when you look at various practitioners in the field and bodybuilders at large, you might learn that lots of them do various periodization strategies, and maybe it's all a wash. Maybe it is just about managing volume. But I certainly, the way I always conceptualize periodization for hypertrophy is trying to keep the stimulus high and manage fatigue. Like I think about SFR, but on like a global scale. And that's where I'm making like little exercise adjustments or volume adjustments or exercise selection, rep range adjustments, things like that. And then obviously implementing things like, I guess a deload would be part of a periodized mesocycle strategy. But we have Coleman et al.'s study on that too, where I guess that in a sense, some people could argue that's a kind of argument for resensitization. Hey, they took a whole week off, they grew insignificantly different to the group that continued training despite doing less. But I guess that was such a small period of time. It wasn't 6 months like the previous studies.
Yeah, I think the study from Lehman College, like you said, led by Max Coleman, I think that is a fantastic start into investigating deloads and also getting some insight into resensitization. I think you could take a lot of perspectives on that, right? You could say, hey, I think it was 9 weeks versus 4 weeks on, 1 week off, 4 weeks on. Hey, no meaningful differences in most outcomes. I think the only one that leaned in favor of the continuous training group was a measure of isometric strength. But in terms of hypertrophy outcomes, basically no difference, but they did, notably less training. I'd also just say that, like, if resensitization is a thing, I think this is like an important take home based on where we're at right now in terms of literature, is that if resensitization is a thing, it's almost certainly going to be a secondary variable, secondary to the more global stimulus under the curve from a longer time period. And that leads me to what I think is another important take home, is that even if resensitization isn't a thing, that doesn't mean you would never deload. That doesn't mean you would never add sets week to week. That doesn't mean you would never, change up the training style or use specialization phases. You might just do it for different reasons, right? So in other words, if, using those strategies allows you to improve the stimulus under the curve from a longer time period, then that is improving the primary training variable, which is, the stimulus, right? Any sort of resensitization effect is probably going to be secondary. And given the state of the research and given just the practical reality of a lot of people's lives, and, it's not super common that someone can be dead on the nose with their training for 52 weeks a year and follow a beautifully periodized plan. I wouldn't like overly complicate periodization beyond practical reasons for now. And I think that Coleman study does a good job of kind of demonstrating that, at least on a smaller scale.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. So we talked about some of the studies that we have, which is relatively little. So I'm very excited about your study on the calves. But when we think about Anecdote, you mentioned some of your athletes like going through strength phases and then hypertrophy and like seeing some benefits there. And I think, at least I've heard, and I guess this is part of Mike Israetel too, because he likes these stimulus proxies such as pumps, soreness, kind of muscle disruption, localized fatigue to those muscles. And when people go through this, it could be a deload even, but it could be an extended active rest or an extended period of lower volume. People tend to find that they're elevated, at least for a short period of time. Is that something you've seen? Do you think there's any real huge relevance to any of that? I guess it's actually probably hard to say.
I've absolutely noticed that. I have a client who he's one of those guys that just has a really hard time like feeling his pecs work in horizontal pressing, which isn't super common, but also like, there's probably at least a handful of listeners nodding their head right now. And we tried a lot of things in terms of troubleshooting, from a technique perspective, length and partials, exercise selection, all the good stuff, right? We definitely had some success there. But then he traveled internationally for about a week and a half. Training was on the back burner. We came back. He's like, man, I've never felt my pecs like this, upon returning. And I think I notice that all the time coming off of a deload or a time where training didn't get the attention it normally does. So I'm a little bit detrained. It just feels like the stimulus is phenomenal, or if something is new and novel. And I think that's really enticing, to be honest. Like, I'm not going to say that that's meaningless, but for the reasons we discussed, I'm also not going to say like we have a ton of evidence supporting kind of this novelty concept of, hey, changing the training style or, resensitizing after time off or deloading is going to ultimately, double the effectiveness of the subsequent training sessions. But I also wouldn't say that there are no clues in the research. There's a study on powerlifters. I think they were pretty dang well-trained powerlifters. I think some European country. It's escaping me exactly where the study is from, but they kind of dropped in some BFR training throughout a program, and they saw. I think they did muscle biopsies and looked at type 1 and type 2 fiber hypertrophy. I think they saw pretty impressive type 1 fiber hypertrophy in the group that did BFR training, because these powerlifters were probably doing, for the most part, low rep training beforehand. There's some other instances of that here and there that kind of give some clues into novelty, but I'm also pretty dang conservative as a scientist. I know that individual studies are quite limited due to many sources of variability. I've also, how exactly we measure what we're measuring. What are we measuring? To what degree is this actual muscle growth versus other things that could kind of infiltrate the measurements of muscle size, et cetera. So there are clues. It's definitely interesting from a practical perspective. And if we circle back to maybe the main takeaway from the Ogasawara study is that you shouldn't totally freak out about time off of training, because you will in a way be resensitized when you get back, is that it might be worth playing around with those things so long as it's not causing you like additional stress, or that complexity isn't adding, negative elements to your training experience. Like, I wouldn't go out of my way to do this unless you're interested in it or you have particular conviction around it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I think within the Coleman study, the guys who took the week off and came back into training, I know they psychologically struggled with that. I think they may even experience more soreness and things like this in that lead-in week, which I don't know, it's just interesting, at least like, hey, that makes sense. That lines up with what a lot of people experience. And I always just take that to be, hey, I don't want to go too hard after having backed off. I can kind of have an intro week, which so many kind of coaches, I think, tend to use when they're leading into a mesocycle, kind of that slightly lesser volume or intensity leading into things, which I think is interesting. And some of you touched on there. And I think it's one of those terms, again, I don't think it's a scientific term, but it kind of relates to adaptive resistance and adaptation and desensitization, say, is that term of staleness. And I think when I say that, a lot of people are like, yeah, like I know what that means. Like things just become less productive. They just start not feeling that good. Maybe it's just fatigue that's occurring there. And then you inject some novelty of rep range change or something like that. And it sounds like you're saying, hey, we don't have good data to suggest that like staleness is something that's like something you have to work around and what have you. And it might not even be related to the muscle becoming stale. It's just fatigue that you're managing more than the kind of desensitization, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. And it's really hard to kind of tease out what's potentially physiological versus what is psychological. So a lot of these things that, again, if we were to do a thought experiment of resensitization definitely exists, and it exists to the point that moving the chess pieces around the chessboard in a certain way could lead you to a higher endpoint, right? Again, things that we've mentioned like deloads, strategic, like set additions over a mesocycle, variation in the focus of a training block, specialization phases, right? Those things, I think, for certain people can be really helpful independent of any resensitization effect, right? Like I think staleness is like just something that you see time and time again in yourself, or if you work with folks, you just see it all the time, and it's hard not to take it seriously, and I don't think we always need scientific terms to describe things. I don't think we always need a physiological rationale to justify decisions by any means, even if it's just because of an absence of evidence in this case. And that's why I think it's important to use those sorts of things when it's probably not going to, again, take away from the primary training variables, right? Again, stimulus under the curve over a longer period of time. Just because you deload and you're doing less in the moment in that given training week, probably going to set you up psychologically, and maybe from a fatigue perspective, to accumulate more over a 6-month period, right? At least in some cases. So I think I coach a lot of powerlifters, and I don't think there's a world where I wouldn't have them deload or modulate the training stimulus week to week in a lot of ways. And I really think it's psychological. Probably one of the biggest changes I've made in my coaching practice, at least from like a starting point over the last couple of years, is really defining goals at the start of a block for where we want to be by the end. So it kind of ends up in this like wave loading type of approach, kind of maybe like an RP style, if you will, for powerlifting, where you're easing in, you're building up. And I think a lot of the benefits are psychological because you're working towards something at the end of the block, and that's something we really care about. We're going to put a lot of stock in. And even though the majority of our clientele aren't in the hypertrophy realm, I like to do that as well for hypertrophy, of kind of like defining a goal, whether that is some sort of exercise we really want to push on, some performance goal, or even as simple as saying, hey, this is the block where we're really pushing chest volume, right? Beyond any potential benefits of specialization from a physiological perspective, that makes things really fun and exciting and removes some staleness. And that's nothing to sneeze at.
See the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. Additionally, you get access to our exclusive Revive Stronger member site, where you'll be able to watch over hundreds of hours worth of educational content. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, it's very interesting you brought up psychology, because it makes me think about, I've obviously gone through periods of time of really adjusting my training volume quite rapidly. It would be surprising for me not to increase, say, a muscle group set volume that I was prioritizing by 2 sets on a week. And that would go a course of, 5 weeks I could manage, and then I have to deload because the volume is just unsustainable. I've kind of changed my philosophy a little bit and been like, hey, as long as I'm doing a good amount of volume and I'm progressing and like I'm recovering from it, I'm happy just like holding here and letting that kind of fatigue accumulate to a point where, like you said, I'm going to have to take some time off. But even now, I'm like, previously I'd be like, hey, I'll take a whole week deload because, hey, even if I don't feel like 4 days in, I feel good, I'll take the other days because maybe I'll get more resensitization and that can propel more gains. Whereas now I'm like, I'm just going to get rid of the fatigue. Once that fatigue is gone, the deload's done its job, I'm back in because this is the thing I'm confident is leading to growth. And I can't say that I haven't done like a isolated study on myself in a vacuum with my clients too, but I can say most people seem to prefer feeling like they're pushing towards something versus kind of having those unsustainable periods and then periods of time that feel way too easy, if that makes sense. But that's just my kind of anecdote with my clients where that psychology comes into it. And it's like, I don't know, it could be the same with gaining a little bit faster, maximizing muscle gain, but accumulating more fat, more frequent diets therefore needed, could lead to the same place as someone just going slower and accumulating slow amounts of muscle, but also fat. So they end up maybe at the same place. It's like, in theory, I can see why that would both work, but maybe for one person, one is just, that's the money for them versus the other. And it could come down to a saying I've been saying so much recently. It's like many roads to Rome, many ways to skin a cat. It's like we like to think there's optimal, but we currently are struggling to find the answer.
Yeah. And I think there's a disconnect at times in the discussion of training variables. I think the most contentious one is volume in terms of the practicality of some of these protocols used in the research. But I would make the case that that's not really the point, because it's meant to test a concept, isolate a variable, and see the directionality and to some extent the magnitude of the effect as a result. And then like I would simultaneously, my view of the research would be more on the high volume side of things. But from a practical perspective, I'm probably like moderate, maybe even like moderate low, because of a lot of the reasons you said. Is like, yeah, if I can simultaneously say that there's a strong dose response relationship with volume, but at the same time, you can say that if those high volumes become unsustainable, then when you zoom out, you've now sacrificed total workload under the curve or total volume under the curve, just like you said. And there probably isn't a right or a wrong approach to that. But I would say more and more recently, especially for people that have more of a variable lifestyle where I don't really know what's going to happen the coming week in terms of their time availability for training, is just having a more flexible sort of approach, right? So, hey, it's okay if, this session ends up taking 20 minutes and you get 10 total sets in or whatever, or this session ends up taking 60 minutes and you're able to triple your workload for the session. Take advantage of those good days when they're there, but also don't view it as a wasted day if you can't get it all in. So yeah, I think zooming out, thinking about the key variables from a longer time period and layering in the practicality and the sustainability, I think a lot of people are largely on the same page about these things. And then, hey, if we learn more about kind of this relative change in stimulus and we can layer that on, awesome. Or hey, maybe it'll be even simpler if we realize that this whole resensitization thing is really not a thing to worry about.
Yeah, I think that's really well stated. I completely agree with the evidence that's been coming out where people view it as if, oh, that's the prescription I'm meant to follow for maximizing my quad growth. I think I've said this before where I posted up some of my quad work and they were like, oh, is that your quad work for one session? I was like, no, that's for the week. They're like, what, 12 sets? I'm like, yeah, like it beats me up and like I just about recover on time and I'm training the rest of my body here, I'm trying to really grow. And they're like, oh, but I've been really pushing my volume up because of the 52 sets that came out in this research paper. And I'm like, there's just so much to say on that topic. And like you said, that paper was never intended to be like a prescription for maximizing quad growth for you, the dear listener. It was like a kind of to show this case of, okay, more volume and kind of not diminishing returns maybe, but you still keep growing. And it doesn't come back to how long was that. A lot of these volume research papers aren't like years long, for example, whereas we are training for years. So it's like, hey, you might be able to sustain that for that short time, but then you're going to have to probably back off at some point. So you might be better off backing off there and just being able to sustain that for your lifestyle versus other ways of going about things.
Yeah, let alone starting to resent training. That's something I've become like more aware of is, maybe 8 years ago when I had a little bit less on my plate, I was, I wanted to do as much as I could, and that was no problem. And it was only positive feelings toward training. But now if I tried to do those sorts of protocols, I'd probably just really start to resent training's footprint on my life, right? And even if the next month goes great because I'm able to kind of white knuckle it and get through it, and the results subsequently are really positive, I'm probably going to resent it, and that's probably going to have a net negative effect because it's going to have downstream effects from a long-term perspective. So I really view things on just a longer time scale now than I did before, and then I view studies as physiological. I'm trying to think of the best word here, but like physiological just concepts to draw off of and not practical at all in a lot of ways. I think there's some room for like, hey, maximizing ecological validity in the sample or the type of population we really care about. But in a lot of ways, like that's why I'm studying the calves. I can get a lot more people to train their calves than I can a lot of other muscle groups because I'm doing a longer study. And I also have a lot of confidence in measuring the calves because they're pretty easy to ultrasound. So I just care about those physiological concepts. And I think in a lot of ways, the research isn't there to tell us how to apply. It's just to say, hey, here's the concept. Now go layer it in and think about that concept from a practical perspective.
That's really well explained. I was trying to say it as well. I think there's a term for it, but I can't think of it. But it's concepts essentially, and it's not the perfect prescription that you're getting from research. And I do think it's unfortunate. I think it is just social media, and people see headlines, and they're suddenly just like they just run with that title, and they start just thinking that's kind of what they should be doing. Whereas these longer form discussions, I think, really help people understand it a bit better, because it is that thing with volume. I think when people, I find, can get into this volume trap where they're like, I can recover from more volume is better for growth. So that's the end thought. They don't think, how long can I keep this going for? Is it going to mean that I have to back off sooner? And it's like all those sort of things come into play. But also the question of when you've got, I always think about this happened to me for sure. I was so obsessed about doing more that I sacrificed the quality of work. Whereas we know that, hey, getting closer to failure is particularly important. I think probably people think it's more important for advanced trainees that if you have so many tasks to do in a day, you're going to be like, I can't do them all to my full effort. So I'm kind of like, I prefer someone working with a bit less than maybe what they can handle. But if they know they're 100% confident, they're giving full quality effort towards that, it just seems to be a bit better for people longer term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think just like from a troubleshooting perspective, it makes sense to make sure the quality is taken care of, and then you modulate the dosage from there. And I actually think that in a lot of ways, improving quality is your most efficient way to increase the dosage. So in other words, like at the end of the day, our muscles are basically just upregulating biochemical cascades that lead to muscle growth. So in a lot of ways, what matters is the dosage on the fiber level. And if you're training closer to failure, if your technique is better, if your exercise selection is better, all of those things are ultimately just going to increase the dosage, therefore improve the efficiency of the training. And I actually think a lot of things are just dosage in disguise. I think, and that's why I think a lot of more advanced folks report being able to progress better at lower volumes than they maybe did before, because I actually think their training skill has increased. So I think a lot of things are dosage in disguise. But again, I'm probably overstating the importance of dosage, because this is kind of my area of interest right now. But that's how I conceptualize it these days: is quality first, and then of that high quality stimulus, modulate the dosage based on, practical things. But really, at the end of the day, I think a lot of it is just dosage.
Yeah, I think, like you mentioned, the practical element is why I've moved more towards that middle ground, because I did feel like if I'm moving too many variables within a mesocycle, I can't be sure of what's leading to what and why I'm making certain calls. So if I'm leaving reps in reserve week 1 and I'm trying to sit around like a minimum effective volume, then of course I'm going to feel fine going into week 2, and I can add because I'm leaving reps in reserve and I'm way undershooting the volume that I can recover from. But that can quickly lead to me getting to a point of which I'm doing these huge escalations of volume, training very, very close to failure. It's like, did I need to completely abuse myself there? Or could I have just started a bit higher, got that quality maybe in terms of proximity to failure a little bit higher, and then just kind of coasted a bit more? Because is the body adapting at that speed to the stimulus you're giving it, where week 1, week 2, it's now you have to increase reps, you have to increase sets? Like, I don't think so. I think just little small progressions week to week probably are all if that, because you're meeting thresholds, no doubt, week 1 to 2 if you repeated that performance.
Yeah, that's music to my ears. Would it be fair to say that your progressions, and when I say progressions, I don't necessarily mean like you keeping up with your adaptations. So just like as you get stronger, you're able to add reps at a given RP or add weight at a given rep number. But when I say progressions, I mean like kind of these proactive progressions of set additions or reductions in target RAR. Would you say that at this point for you, those are largely for practical reasons, as opposed to saying, I'm going to purposely kind of drag my feet during these progressions, so purposely go slower than I otherwise could, so that I can kind of milk out that on ramp of the mesocycle? Does that question make sense?
I think so. I think my theory is, I want to kind of, the way I conceptualize it is, I think about stimulus more so like I think about like a maximal adaptive stimulus versus a volume necessarily, because I think volume discounts RAR, it discounts exercise selection, it discounts, I don't know, loads of different things potentially. So I think about, I want to kind of hold this adaptive stimulus that I feel like is maximizing growth and staying here for as long as possible. So if I can make small progressions on a week-to-week basis, I can be confident that I'm staying in that zone, because if I don't try and kind of almost proactively progress, I feel like I could be leaving something behind, if that makes sense. Like if I just let it come to me, I'm like, it's always going to feel really hard. I still want to be trying and beat something, even if it's not a PR on a week-to-week. It's not a PR on a week-to-week basis. It's just working within my capacity, and hopefully by the end of that month, 2 months mesocycle, it's now a PR versus the last one. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, I think I gotcha. So in other words, like the common set addition mesocycle framework, my understanding is that instead of getting to what you think you could handle and benefit from a maximal perspective, you kind of drag your feet on the way up. And when I say drag your feet, like you're kind of purposefully capping your progressions on a week-to-week basis in terms of the stimulus. Because the thinking would be, from a resensitization perspective, is I don't need to get to the peak workload that I can handle this week, because I'm more sensitive to training coming off of my deload, coming off of my intro week, whatever. So I'm going to have kind of this longer on-ramp. Whereas what I'm saying, or what I think you're saying, and I tend to agree, is let's view it more from a practical lens of, sure, I might do an intro week with lower volume, higher RER, and I might have a bit of an on-ramp, but that's for practical reasons to make sure I don't, get incredibly sore and can't recover session to session, motivation falls, and I have to deload early because now I've decreased the stimulus under the curve for the mesocycle. Does that resonate?
Exactly that. That's it. Yeah, that's exactly the way I like to go about it, is that sense of, we know, hey, muscle damage, soreness, if we can kind of say they're likely bound to one another, is going to be excessively high if I just like go guns blazing week one. I definitely kind of, from practical reasons of wanting to manage that fatigue side more than anything, the unwanted fatigue, start a bit low, and then kind of the first week, maybe there's some set additions, and then it's kind of coasting here, unless something really changes where I'm just like, hey, I just definitely need to make a change. It's more so coasting there for as long as I can, where I'm like living in that maximal adaptive stimulus, as the way I like to frame it, until my body's just like, hey, you got to pull back at some point. Versus, like you said, trying to milk out the easy gains because we've resensitized. I just haven't been convinced that was serving me particularly well, because it would lead to me really needing to be like, hey, I'm just training really easy, and it feels too easy to be as productive as I could be. So that's the way I've kind of gone about it. And to bring it back to what you said there with that, when you do think about minimum effective volume and then resensitizing, if you didn't make any adjustments, the theory would go, you'd need to do more volume maybe the next mesocycle. So your MEV theoretically goes up over time. And that just never really, I don't know, in practice worked out for me either, because it then would become unsustainable where your MEV is almost like where your MRV was, and then you'd have to do a resensitization phase to kind of come back into it. Well, I'm not saying it's like wrong, but it just seemed excessive and a bit extreme in practice once I'd done it after a while.
Yeah, I tend to agree, but I'll also say, just, I guess, out of humility from a coaching experience perspective and from a scientific perspective, is that's an opinion, and that's like informed based on practical experience and intuition and what I think we have the strongest evidence for, both anecdotally and again from a scientific perspective. But I very much tend to agree, and that's kind of how I've shifted over time as well. I do think it's important to also point out, and I think this kind of is piggybacking off of what you said at the end there regarding the minimum effective volume potentially shifting up or down. I highly doubt that changes on a short time scale. I think if you look at the extremes of, again, a noob versus someone that's been training for 20 years, a noob is going to grow from one set, almost certainly. Someone that's been training for 20 years, probably not. So I think it does occur, but I don't think that just because you did, say, 15 sets for a given muscle group in week 3 of your block, and then a personal emergency came up in week 4 and you're only able to do 5 sets for that muscle, that all of a sudden that's not effective just because you had a reduction in volume. And circling back to what we said at the very beginning, like, hey, this resensitization concept in a lot of ways is interesting because it kind of underlies a lot of things. I think that's a great example. And I think I originally misinterpreted a lot of the volume research to think that going from 15 sets to 5 sets because you're adapted to 15 is no longer productive. But we see in the research that that still occurs, right? There's a study from Bickle and colleagues that gives us some indication that muscle growth can definitely still occur even after reducing volume. We see it on kind of a cohort level as well, where they report the average volumes before the study. One or multiple groups will train at a lower volume compared to what they're doing before, and they still grow muscle, right? So I don't think that these targets are moving in a short time period all that much. I think what could be moving is your maximal recoverable volume because of the repeated bout effect, because that is a pretty short-term thing, right? If you do just a single exposure to a new exercise, right, that goes a long way in terms of being able to tolerate 3, 4, or 5 hard sets of that. But in terms of, what you can generally benefit from and what you can, the minimum amount that you can potentially benefit from, I've shifted on this to think that I don't think it's totally a moving target. And I think if it were to be a moving target, resensitization would have to be a primary variable. I think it might be a secondary variable, and it's probably has a good chance of being something we really don't need to worry about from a physiological perspective.
I think that's really, really well stated, especially the kind of MEV. It's definitely a concept and it's a reality, but it's a longer term thing. I for sure would agree with that. I mean, it's hard to disagree with that. And everything you said there, I think a lot of the elements of resensitization really do hold, where we're making those practical adjustments to the program to keep it even like psychologically sensitive to the person and enjoyable. But whether or not it's like for the underlying reasons that might be theorized for some people, it may not be there. So it's kind of similar to, as an example, I was just thinking as I come like week 1 into a mesocycle, if I'm doing lunges for the first time, like that's something I'll be like, maybe 1 set on lunges because they are just very disruptive. They're going to cause loads of damage. But by week 2, I can definitely do 2 sets. Next mesocycle, I can start off with 2, maybe even maybe 3 sets. It kind of depends on the person and how they're getting on with it. But it's kind of that adaptation aspect. And I think about it like meeting thresholds. Like you said, some people think, they get to their peak at the end of a mesocycle, they deload and they have to start at a new high peak. It's like, no, you just need to meet your lower end thresholds again in terms of like a volume or an intensity, and you're going to still continue to see growth. It's just like you mentioned a few times, it's the dose. You just might not see it quite as fast. So yeah, I think that makes so much sense. I don't know if there's any other research you've got going on apart from the calf study on this, or if there's anything else you wanted to talk about regarding resensitization.
Yeah, I'll start with your second question first. Sometimes I like to just I don't know how you go about this, Steve, but if I'm looking at progress photos for a client, I like to take I like a 2-step process. The first is like almost like scooting my chair back from my computer and looking at the 2 photos and just generally seeing like which looks better, right? So like getting a high level view. And then I'll scoot in and my eyes aren't all that good. So I'll get really close to my computer and, look at the details, be like, oh, do we see some more lines? What little things can we detect? Because I think you need both, right? You kind of need that high level perspective. You also need to zoom in, double click and see, what do we have going on here from a very detailed perspective. And even though I'm kind of double clicking on this specific concept of, hey, does resensitization require muscle atrophy that we identified as a fundamental question that needs to be answered? That's a very detail-oriented question. But then when I scoop my chair back and I think about it from a high level, I say, if I were to just take the average person over the next 10 years, what is probably going to matter for them maximizing their muscle growth? I think it's probably how much quality training did they get in, and it's probably less about how well did they manipulate their relative changes in dosage from a week to week or a mesocycle to mesocycle time frame, right? That's not to say these sorts of things don't matter, right? That would be that'd be quite, counterintuitive for me to say because we spend a lot of time as researchers thinking about these details, but I think that's an important perspective to keep in mind on resensitization. And therefore, hopefully it's come across that while I'm excited about the concept, it's also not something that I think should add undue stress or complexity beyond a lot of practical things for now. And if the evidence shifts over time, I'd be surprised if it's going to make or break your training, but it might be the cherry on top for program design reasons. Regarding what we have in the works, I mean, this is kind of my main focus from a data collection perspective. I was telling you before we hit record that we have a good amount of data like collected and studies completed that we're analyzing, whether those are meta-analyses or individual studies, depending on when this is released. Some of those might be out at that point. I'd also I have a bit of a conflict of interest here recommending it, but my business partner Zach Robinson, who we've had on the show, he recently finished his PhD, and he is such a diligent scientist that he's probably not going to do a whole lot of talking about it before he fully wraps his head around it. But he did his PhD on individual response variation. So, how much do different people's physiology respond to different types of training? And I mentioned that because that was a big undertaking for our lab, and that study's all done, but it's a really, really exciting topic. And I'm mostly just trying to give him some love because he put a lot of work into that. And it was a big project for our lab that I think is going to be very helpful for the field, not only from a conceptual and practical perspective, but also from a methodological perspective to kind of expedite a lot of research in the future, which I'm excited about. So we have a lot of things going on, but slowly chipping away. But the resensitization thing is the focus for now.
I really, first of all, just wanted to say I loved your idea of like zooming out before then zooming in, because I do think that's really important, because I think it's becoming more of a thing now that evidence-based practice and research studies are getting more and more attention. You can, I don't know, be 15 years old and you could be digging into PubMed and reading studies. Whereas when I was 15, I don't know, PubMed, I didn't even know what it was. So it's just becoming way more apparent to people. And so it's getting a bit of kickback of like, people are getting lost in the weeds and all of this, and like trying to optimize via resensitization, just get into the gym and train type of thing. I understand where that frustration comes from. So I like that you have this balance of, hey, zoom out, are things improving? Great, we don't have to worry too much. But also you can zoom in and be more granular and potentially try and optimize where it makes more sense to. So I think just knowing that resensitization is something that you're looking into, it's a concept that we can think about, but don't get kind of like stuck in the mud with it, I think is brilliant. And then I'll have to bring Zach on to talk about this study at some point. I'm sure he will be open to that. And I'm sure you guys, with your podcast, will be talking about it. I did want to bring that up. You guys are doing a great job with your podcast. I know we talked off air, you're going to be, and I'm going to put you out there now, you're going to be investing a little bit more time and effort into the podcast, which I'm excited for, because I think you guys do a great job. But if you've got anything else with data-driven strength in the pipeline, or feel free to kind of push your coaching, what have you, if you've got capacity for it, that is.
Hey, you can always reach out and see where we're at based on when you reach out. But yeah, like you said, I think I not only enjoy trying to communicate these things in this medium, but I also feel like I get a lot of value from discussions like these. So selfishly, I really like the podcast medium, and also we've gotten probably the most feedback and the best feedback on our podcast, and also just think it kind of fits our personalities and our communication styles and our I guess values from a scientific communication perspective pretty well. So like you said, the plan here is to focus more on the podcast and give that some more love and try to make it as good as we can be. So if you're interested, you can check out the Data Driven Strength podcast. For our other stuff, we do make content on other platforms, consistently inconsistent at this point in our academic training, but nonetheless, we do the best we can on that front. And if you just go to my Instagram, Josh.datadrivenstrength, you can find all of the links there.
I know you've got a bit of time, Josh, and there's just one thing that I think might be worth covering with this discussion, which I'm frustrated I kind of did the close before, but I just think someone might think about it, and I think it'll be useful to, because we haven't touched on it at all, but it's the kind of the thought of using time away from the gym for kind of joint connective tissue recovery and health and longevity. So again, it might be that, hey, you feel recovered after 4 days of deloading or backing off, however you're going about that. The muscles might be ready to go, but how are the joints connective tissue? Could they be accumulating any injuries and stuff that you could do with more time off at various standpoints? Maybe it's just good practice to take 2 weeks off every year just to allow those things to kind of recover. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's something that people really need to be concerned about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll start by saying this is not an area of expertise. I am aware of some evidence to indicate that the process, I guess just to not use scientific terms here, the process of the recovery process of those tissues might be a little bit slower than skeletal muscle. So there could be reason to believe that, hey, just because your muscles can recover from a given stimulus, in a given period of time, and just because you can keep pushing, it might be smart to proactively pull back, give yourself a break, make sure those connective tissues, those joints are feeling good. So again, you can maximize the stimulus over a longer period of time. I would say that's not a primary level of defense, if you will. I would start with two things. The first is just appropriately managing the workload to ensure that you really never push to that point, because even if more volume is better in isolation and you can push up to 52 sets and potentially benefit from it, and you need to also subsequently take time away to kind of catch up recovery wise to push back up there, again, you're just, to me, that's kind of backwards in a lot of ways to proactively do that. The second thing I'd say, especially from a hypertrophy perspective, is to really ensure exercise selection is as efficient as possible with minimal negative consequences. I will say from a powerlifting perspective, I do the proactive thing a decent bit, but again, that is secondary to ensuring the workload is sustainable. Like, I don't want to rely on, a 2-week active rest phase once a year to, make sure that someone can recover and benefit from the training that I'm giving them. But I also think that can be used if someone is really beat up and we kind of miscalibrated that a little bit. And it's all the time. Like, honestly, with powerlifting, I don't think the most productive training is sustainable. And that kind of leads to that wave loading sort of approach. So I think proactive approaches for powerlifting probably make sense, less so for bodybuilding or physique type training. And it would be a second layer of defense, if you will, to say, hey, we're going to, resensitize, but more so for the joint side of things.
I think that's really well said. I think when you look at various sports and injury rates, like bodybuilding, I believe is pretty low on there. And especially if, you're doing things like appropriate exercise selection, technique, you're managing fatigue as you go along, maybe the staleness element of like joint connective tissue building up, you rotate, you don't have to squat, bench, deadlift. Whereas it makes much more sense when you're stuck using particular tools a little bit more, that you might have to be a bit more proactive about it. And in my personal experience, it's not something that I've personally needed. And I think, I don't know, we're very resilient. Maybe enhanced might be a little bit different. I don't know, because the joint and connective tissue recovery rates and how they grow alongside the muscle tissue, it's not an area that I'm not an expert in at all. So I don't want to talk to that. I could see that being a little bit different. Then the only other thing, and again, sorry to keep you here after we kind of closed, but the only other thing I was thinking was, something I've heard talked about with the studies where they kind of took time off and matched growth. For example, with the Coleman study, quite often the people who are in the study are newbies. So the amount that people talk about, hey, they're matching growth because they're kind of at their growth capacity for it. Like, they're not able to grow from, like, it's a lot of volume anyway, and they're pushing past the amount that they're going to grow from. Whereas someone advanced in that period of time off also would lose much more than someone newbie. They're not going to lose as much during that period of time. So it's kind of an argument for it being a bit more risky as an advanced trainee to go through such a thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on like level of advancement and resensitization being something to be more concerned about.
Yeah. So just to make sure I'm understanding, kind of what you're saying is the rate of gain following the detraining period in an untrained person will be so high that it doesn't matter if they lost a little bit of muscle beforehand. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think it was, so like newbies will cap gains they make. So the total volume that the group did who didn't take the break, they could have got just as good gains by doing less, which was shown because they're capped. Yeah. They just can't grow any more than they're already growing because they're already growing at their maximum.
I think I understand what you're saying now. I think what I said was kind of the same thing, maybe just coming from a different perspective. Right. But I got you now. I think that makes a lot of sense, just like intuitively. But then think about the research in general. There's a good amount of research on untrained individuals. And we see pretty often, whether it's a volume study, whether it's a range of motion study, whether it's to some degree a proximity to failure study, we do see that those differences in training variables can cause a difference in growth in untrained people. So you can have an untrained person grow suboptimally, even though they're untrained and they're doing hard training, but there's another group doing hard training that's a little bit better. We see that, like, that occurs. So the short answer is no. I don't think that concept would necessarily like change the things that we talked about throughout the podcast, right? So in other words, the training status would fundamentally change what we're talking about. I could take this back in a few years if we get further insight on this, but I think in a lot of ways, training studies on untrained people, for the most part, will apply to trained folks. It's just going to be a matter of magnitude. And we've just seen that in multiple bodies of literature, that's kind of my working hypothesis. And I think the same thing would apply here, because again, if there was this hard adaptation capacity, just to put a number on it, an untrained person can only grow 10% in 10 weeks, right? Then again, we would just see all these untrained people in studies grow 10% in 10 weeks, and you wouldn't have the possibility for a higher volume group to grow 13%, right? And we do see that. So that's why I think, again, I wouldn't necessarily change the recommendations on the basis that many of the studies do use untrained folks.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, thank you I just had looked through my notes quickly and I was like, oh, there was a couple of things here that I think might be interesting to talk to you about and get them done. So again, Josh, you mentioned all the things that you have going on, very exciting, and I'll make sure people know where they can kind of find all the work that you're doing if they want to get in touch for coaching or anything, or if they have a question for the podcast. I guess it's good to go seek out your Instagram too. So I'll make sure that's all linked in the description. But guys, thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks, Steve.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.